but we are very social here. So we're not social distancing, we're
We're physically distancing.
All right, so what I'm going to do is tell the story of the sculpture of Emperor Norton and why my father created the first one that Denise is standing next to in 1936. Now, this is also a tale of North Beach. So in the 30s, there were, as I had in other stories, there were about 4 bars that the Bohemians hung out in, of which my father was a proud member. There was the Black Cat, the Iron Pot, there was Specs, and there was the New Tivoli. It was not the Savoy Tivoli, it was the New Tivoli at the time. It was owned by Nick Finocchio, and Nick Finocchio had this amazing scene there. Every day at about 5:30, the artists would file in. There was actually a section of the bar that was reserved for the artist to hang out in, and he wouldn't allow anyone else to sit there until all the crew came in. And there were some amazing folks that hung out in this place, including Bernard Zockheim, who was one of the lead painters in the murals in Coit Tower. There's Sergeant Johnson, who was an African-American artist who lived up that hill and did several pieces of public art in San Francisco. There was Benny Bufano, who was a prominent San Francisco neighborhood. There was this sketch artist, her name was Frida Kahlo, and her boyfriend, Diego Rivera, when they were in town, would show up at these things. There was even poets there. Poets like Langston Hughes would show up on occasion for this little rendezvous. So they talked among themselves about, their artwork and what they were doing. And kind of my father becomes a junior member because he was like in his early 30s, right? And late 20s. So they could all see the war coming. They could all see in the Depression the rise of fascism. And so they all decided that, hey, what we need on the West Coast is like kind of a Statue of Liberty that would represent what we call today as tolerance, instead of the intolerance and the ignorance that was coming out of Japan, Rome, and Berlin. So they kind of assigned my father the task of finding a character in San Francisco history that would represent that kind of progressive ideas and could go up as a statue at that time, like on the west coast of the waterfront. And he envisioned it huge, that would be like the greeting, right? So he started researching, and he came across Emperor Norton, which at that time in the 30s, the only people that remembered Emperor Norton, there was a comic strip that made him look like a buffoon and a fool, right? But he came across and started reading about the Emperor Norton, and he discovered that Emperor Norton was the only white man that stood up against the Chinese exclusion laws in the state assembly, stood against slavery, actually advocated for women's rights to vote. And there was this whole progressive side, was a champion of the immigrants, stood up against this guy Kearney, who was organizing white people against the Chinese in Chinatown, right? At the time, stood up publicly against this guy, and was a major champion of the oppressed and welcomed the immigrant. So we wrote this up during my father's life. We wrote this up to describe Emperor Norton, and my father decided that's it. That's our Statue of Liberty. We need to put this up. We need for everybody to be able to see this statue and celebrate the immigrants and not come down against them. So we wrote this up about Norton. Norton I, Emperor of the United States, Protector of Mexico. which is a story I'll tell you about how he got to that title.
Be as
Joshua
loud as you
Abraham
can.
Norton was a merchant, English, Jewish, and possibly Dutch descendant who immigrated to San Francisco from the Cape of Good Hope, Africa, November the 21st, 1849. He embarked upon the shores of our fair city at Montgomery Street between Washington and Jackson and quickly established what would be his real estate and general brokerage firm within a few blocks of that point. Norton was an affable, daring businessman who quickly became a fixture on San Francisco's scene during the gold rush days. Renowned for both his honesty and shrewdness, he soon amassed a fortune which topped $250,000 in 1853.
Whoa.
Roughly 100 years before I was born. It was that year he came upon the scheme to monopolize the rice market. He went into a partnership with several other people, but operated under the name J. Norton and Company. The scheme failed, and the ensuing prolonged litigation finally bankrupted Norton as he took the brunt of the legal proceedings. Severely reduced, Norton now faced an economy which too had reached a rock bottom hitherto unseen in the United States. San Francisco's depression was exacerbated by the end of the gold rush. Banks and businesses were closing in record numbers, making it impossible for Norton to recoup and get started again. Bankrupt in 1856, Norton became a recluse. His friends of better times, mostly brethren from the Masonic Lodge, helped him financially as well as trying to cheer him up by talking politics. Long an advocate of the divine right of kings and eventually referred to as the emperor in his day, Norton emerged in full regalia dress in 1859, delivering the first of many proclamations to San Francisco Call newspaper, this declaring himself Emperor of the United States.
I love it.
The paper printed it in San Francisco with a tradition of gracious humanity, went right along with it. He was allowed to partake in all aspects of society in exchange for promissory notes. He printed his own money, right? And merchants accepted it. And the reason merchants accepted it is a cool story. Is because at that time it was the Barbary Coast, and he would walk the Barbary Coast along the waterfront, and it was semi, merchants, kind of like shady deals going on a lot of times. But if the emperor bought something there with his money, the merchant, who was a legitimate merchant, would display it and would tell everyone, this place really does sell chicken, not rat. This place really does sell real meat or real food, because there was no regulatory people at the time. So the emperor's notes were valuable to merchants. Even drivers of horses and carriages would take his note, because a lot of them were drunk, turn over, would kill people. So if you had an emperor's note displayed in the carriage, on the side of the carriage, you knew, hey, that's a safe carriage, right? So anyway, that was really important that he did this. He was allowed to partake in all aspects of the society. Theaters, restaurants, fashionable haberdashery vied for his patronage and proudly displayed his Norton notes in all their windows. It was fashionable and profitable advertising. All forms of public transportation, far and near, accepted him. The commander of the Presidio provided the now famous uniform that he wore, which was a Union soldier's private hat, and sometimes he was complimented with a Lincoln stovetop hat with a feather on it, right? So anyway, the famous coat. The Board of Supervisors provided money in the following years to keep him in said uniform as each wore out, because he was valuable to the city. In the early 1860s, with a little help from the U.S. Army stationed at Presidio, not just a little help, Norton proclaimed himself the protector of Mexico when Spain threatened to install the emperor of their own. What happened was, And Norton was loved by all social classes, high and low, and he was respected high and low. And he used to play chess and checkers with the commanding general of the Presidio every week. So they were close friends. And so when the American Civil War was about to broke out, several European powers were talking about reinvading this continent to take Mexico back as a colony. What happened is he marched down to the Presidio. Yes, his friend, he said he ordered U.S. forces up on alert to go defend Mexico. And because he was his friend, they were up on alert and they started marching. They got as far as Monterrey. Word got back to those embassies that U.S. forces were on the way to support the Mexicans in defending their country.
Wow.
And the armadas turned around in the ocean. Right. And the next day in the call, the headline was, Emperor of the United States, Protector of Mexico.
Ole!
Yeah. In the early 1860s, with the help of the, excuse me, I already read that. Go on.
Moving on to the 1870s.
He opposed slavery and demanded both Lincoln and Jefferson Davis come before him, and he would decide what the justice of the cause. Where sane men remained silent, the mad Norton clearly spoke out against ethnic injustice. He spoke out against discriminatory laws at the time, which made the evidence of San Francisco's many thousands of Chinese inadmissible in courts, and loudly decried the immigration laws which denied entry to a man because of the color of his skin. He was familiar with all officials high and low, making frequent trips to the sessions to the state legislature in Sacramento. His extraordinary intelligence apparent. He spoke out on the issues of the day, and his opinions were readily accepted. On one of his trips to Sacramento, he missed the ferry to the East Bay because, being incensed and in his madness, proclaimed that a bridge should be built.
The audacity.
Right? A bridge should be built from the East Bay to Telegraph Hill. He lived on Telegraph Hill. That's another story. He filled his days in San Francisco walking the streets, making sure the policemen were on duty. Various city ordinances were enforced, that sidewalks remain unobstructed, and markets and docks were ran properly. He levied his own taxes, which prominent merchants paid without hesitation. Norton's two dogs. Now, they weren't really Norton's dogs.
I thought you were going to say they weren't really dogs.
Norton's entourage, and this is where we get a famous San Francisco saying. Norton's entourage included two dogs that also lived on Telegraph Hill, and they were famous in their own right. They were Bummer and Lazarus.
Oh.
Now, Bummer and Lazarus were pals, and they would follow the emperor's entourage. And when the emperor would come to do his notes to various vendors, they were particularly realized that if they hung out with the emperor, that when it came to a butcher or they came to a baker, that the butcher would cut off the fat, throw it to the dogs. They were smart, these dogs. Well, they're feral, and so they always hung out with the emperor because they knew that it was good a living. And when they come to a baker, they would cut off the heel, and the heel of the loaf of bread would go to the dogs. So these entourages that the emperor did around the Embarcadero, going from vendor to vendor to vendor, took hours and hours and hours. They were serious work. So Lazarus was cool. He was the younger one, and he could stay up with Norton. But Bummer, when he got old, was getting old, and he had a hard time walking. And at the end of one of these entourages, when the emperor had left the baker, Bummer, came along looking for his kid behind the emperor who had already left. And the butcher looked down at him and said, "Oh, you two? What a
That's where we get that. Wow.
On January 8th, on January 8th, 1880, while conducting one of his daily sojourns and surrounded by his loyal subjects, Norton collapsed and died on the corner of California and DuPont Street, now Grant Avenue. Wow. Two of his pre-Emperor Day merchant friends, Mr. Estlin and Mr. Brewer, took up contributions so that he could have a funeral befitting a king. They went to what is now the Pacific Union Club, where members quickly found all the additional donors. He lay in state at City Hall, while 10,000 San Franciscos mourned from all walks of life, viewed his body and proclaimed touchingly "Les Ros es mort" as they passed by. It was estimated that over 30,000 people in one way or another paid tribute to him by the end of the funeral. He had the only state funeral in San Francisco until Mayor Moscone and Harvey Milk.
Wow.
Harvey Milk were murdered, and Lee, Mayor Lee, is the only other one that had a state funeral at City Hall. In 1938, Peter Macchiarini thought it was high time that San Franciscans memorialized their beloved monarch and created a sculpture befitting the king. My father actually started that sculpture 2 years before, 36, and he evolved several editions of it. He portrayed the sculpture befitting a king, portrayed standing regally with his famous Civil War private's hat and coat. Macchiarini hoped that the city would one day consider erecting it overlooking Montgomery Street. At the time, the interest in if the art scene in San Francisco lay elsewhere, and nothing ever came of it. That's not exactly true. There's more to that story too. We had at the time a fascist mayor. His name was Mayor Rossi. He supported the attack upon the longshoremen in 1934. He would go down to the waterfront and salute the Italian ships that came in with a fascist. Right, yeah, there was a swimming pool named after him. Luckily, the name's been changed. Anyway, they had no interest in tolerance at the time, which was the idea behind the sculpture. And so it never went as like a huge statue. And my father was kind of brokenhearted about it. He got press. This is 1939. He got some press in the Chronicle talking about doing the sculpture. Okay.